So I've been working with teacher leadership when it comes to academic language instruction, which I'm going to be troubling in just a minute, for a long time. As she noted, I'm the co-author of these two books. I'm going to give you a little analysis, a little text analysis of today's talk so you know what to expect. I will start with a story time, then I'll move into our evolving field of English language education and wrap up with an essential question for practice 3 times so you know what to expect. I am a storyteller, and by nature, I embed stories in pretty much every conversation I have. So before we do that, I want to talk quickly about tension. I avoid tension in my personal life, but in my professional life, I think I'm a junkie. I seek it out. I think it's important for us to put ourselves in places of tension as much as we can professionally so that we can do better. So you'll notice that in the talk today, you'll hear me wrestling with myself, and I might say things that cause you to wrestle with yourself as well. So I want to start with a quote. This student, Lai Chia Wang, had not even graduated from high school yet when she was quoted saying, "A mentor once told me, ELL is a system that makes you lose your language. And one day when you want to learn your language again, it is typically in college, where you have to pay. Or in other words, the system makes you lose your language and then benefits from it once you attempt to relearn it. While it may be unintentional, this is a cycle of capitalism, white supremacy, and cultural assimilation." So I want for all of us to sit with Lai Chia's words, okay? This is her real experience here. So we'll start with a story. I want to introduce you to Maggie and Cindy. Maggie and Cindy are a lesbian macaw couple that live in a bird sanctuary in Brazil. They adopt rollaway eggs. My husband is from Argentina, and so we went on a trip and we went to Cataratas Iguazu, which are the Iguazu waterfalls, and while we were there, we were lucky enough to meet Maggie and Cindy. The people working at the conservation center explained to us that as we approached Maggie and Cindy, here's my daughter Isa, as we approached Maggie and Cindy, we should not speak. They told us we were not allowed to talk. The reason being that they grew up in a Brazilian zoo where they heard people saying arará, arará when they saw them. Arará is the Portuguese word for macaw. So these two birds thought that the sound that they were supposed to make was arará. And if they're released into the wild, they're not safe because other macaws would recognize them as foreign and might kill them. So these two macaws had to stay in the bird sanctuary forever. So I use Maggie and Cindy as a platform to talk about how important language is in the animal kingdom. So I'm not here to make a case against teaching language, right? Rather to say that we know that language is critical for access across the animal kingdom, including humanity. And here's a little photo of my first book launch. It was in the summer of 2020, and it was in my backyard with my co-author. And our teacher leadership book uses the macaw as the symbol. So as I shared previously with TESOL International, I've done some really awesome stuff. I've worked with prepared coaches across the country. We've got a big cohort in Hawaii, Atlanta, South Dakota, Michigan. So we've done some really cool work. And really what this is centering folks like you who are already the experts to be the expert on site and stop hiring professors like me to come out and give PD. So how can we really platform the expertise that already exists in schools? It's unintentionally been a bit of a female empowerment movement, I will admit, but it's been a lot of fun. So what we do know is that language teaching and learning is complex. That's not news to anybody in this room. When we think about the elements of language, phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, that's some pretty advanced stuff that we have to make sense to our kids. And in the case that you are training teachers or coaching teachers, you have to make it make sense to your gen ed colleagues, right? One paradigm that a lot of folks are familiar with is the bricks and mortar paradigm. How many of you are familiar with this? So some years ago, I expanded bricks and mortar to have bricks, mortar, and building. So if we think about this as 3 layers, the bricks being the phonemes, the word parts. So phonology, morphology, and semantics, sentence being syntax, and then discourse being the text type or the genre. Being so close to WITA, I would be remiss to not point out all of the amazing work that they do around functionalism. And functionalism talks a lot about genre-informed pedagogy. And I think if I'm going to use my twins' Gen Z language, this is the one we're sleeping on, right? Is discourse. This is the area where I think we really need a lot more attention. And I'm going to give you an example of why. So, unkind interlocutors are everywhere. What's an interlocutor? That's the person that you're talking to, right? And we want to prepare our students for this perfectly kind, wonderful world, but we know that that's not the case. This is a conversation I overheard from a colleague of mine at my university that will go unnamed. He got an email from a student, and the email went something like this. Hey John, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do for class tomorrow. What is the assignment? My sister's car broke down, so I missed class yesterday. Please tell me what I need to do. RN. These are some of the reactions from the professor. Hay is for horses. Whatever happened to more polite greetings? Where does he get off calling me John? This generation doesn't appreciate how hard it is to earn a terminal degree. It's Dr. Wilshire, thank you. He is definitely starting our relationship off on the wrong foot by yelling at me in an email. I have this guy pegged. Has he even checked the syllabus or logged into the class site? He doesn't value my time. Why is he telling me about his sister's car? This is too much information to tell your college professor. What is RN? Registered nurse? Closing? Thank you? Best? This kid doesn't take me or my class seriously. I will be surprised if he passes. All right, so we're going to sit in that tension there, right? I think we can all understand how a scenario like this could take place. So our first essential question that we will discuss, and I'm going to have you do a turn and talk just with one other person, or if your preference is to free write, you can free write, and I'm going to try to hold us to 1 minute. So if you can just give your brief thoughts. How can we make the language of school accessible to multilingual learners of English? And you'll notice that little tension box is going to pop up here and there, and that's don't choose a team. How can we embrace that tension? All right, go ahead. Are you ready? All right. I am in my backyard, lying in my hammock, looking up at my beautiful leaves on my linden tree. It's a sunny day. My garden is looking better than ever. I'm not a good gardener because it's 2020 and we haven't been able to leave the house for a while. My husband is making burgers on the grill, and I notice as I'm looking up at the sky, plumes of smoke and helicopters. I live about 1 mile away from where George Floyd was murdered. And I was smacked with the disparate experiences that I was having and that my immediate community members were having. Right? I'm lying there in this beautiful setting, my husband's making burgers, and my community is suffering. My community is afraid, and I'm aware of my positionality at this time. My husband then calls to me and says, hey, my boss said we can't use the words blacklisted and whitelisted anymore. And I thought, wow, if a national bank, my husband works in IT, if a national bank is calling to the table their employees about how they might be contributing to white supremacy, how is my field going to respond? I wondered. And our field did respond. Our field has responded. I think we found ourselves in a little bit of a global reckoning. There was an association of Black linguists who composed a statement on anti-Black racism and Black linguistic justice, and in it they had a list of demands. I'm going to read one of the demands in its original form to you right now. We demand that teachers and researchers acknowledge that socially constructed terms such as academic language and standard English are false and entrenched in notions of white supremacy and whiteness that contribute to anti-Black linguistic racism. Now again, as language teachers, let's notice the genre. This is a demand, right? This isn't a suggestion, this isn't an opinion, this is a demand. And personally for me, having just published that book that I was so proud of, that's the second edition, I made it better the second time around. I had a whole chapter on academic language. My career was standing on academic language. It was something I was very proud of. So to be called in this way was hard. And I had to sit with it for a while. And I talked to a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues. And a close friend, Jenna Cushing-Lubner, then introduced me to Natalia Benjamin, and we started to put our heads together on what this book would be, the seeds of this book. So what does liberatory language learning look like? So I want to do a little chronology here, and that's where did this idea of academic language come from in the first place? I'm going to attribute it to Jim Cummins, but I think it could probably be traced back earlier than that. In 1976, Jim Cummins comes out with what he calls the threshold hypothesis. And the threshold hypothesis states that bilingual children must attain minimum threshold levels of proficiency in both languages to experience positive cognitive academic benefits from bilingualism. So basically, if you haven't achieved proficiency in both languages, you are semilingual. And semilingual means you don't fully speak one language or the other, and so you're kind of a non-functioning human. The higher threshold is if you are proficient in 2 languages, you're going to reap great benefits, right? So this idea of semilingualism is one that later on is called out. And then in 1979, we are introduced to BICS and CALP. How many of you are familiar with BICS and CALP? BICS and CALP is critical to the canon of ESL teacher preparation. We all know about BICS and CALP, and we don't tend to question BICS and CALP. So basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. And take a look at all of the scholarship, and this is just the tip of the iceberg around academic language. I included my own book, right? So again, academic language has been at the forefront of the work of English language teachers now for a long time. So I first noticed the epic battle of the linguistic titans around the summer of 2020. However, I think it started earlier than that. And I call this the linguistic smackdown, because you could see these 2 figureheads going at it in a way that I thought was really interesting. The first one being Jim Cummins. So Jim Cummins is a Canadian linguist. He developed BICS and CALP, right? So he's really central to a lot of our scholarship, and his work is centered on academic language instruction for equity. Nelson Flores is a Puerto Rican linguist whose research is in the areas of translanguaging and radiolinguistics, and his work reveals ways in which learners and language are racialized, and he promotes an anti-racist stance in language education. So I'm going to give you just a brief back and forth between these 2. They actually started going at it through the Harvard Education Review, as one would if they wanted to have an argument. Right? And then they continued the argument, Flores on his blog post, and Cummins in keynote addresses across Canada. It's a funny way to fight, isn't it? All right, so, and I recommend this article if you have not read it. I think it's so important, Undoing Appropriateness, Radiolinguistic Ideologies and Language Diversity in Education in 2015. Flores and Rosa state, semilingualism is a general theory of why elite bilingualism, or the bilingualism of affluent communities, appears to lead to improved cognitive ability, while minoritized bilingualism of marginalized communities, appears to lead to cognitive deficiencies. A year later, Nelson Flores says the existing model in education implies that multilingual learners are in need of linguistic remediation to provide them with access to the subject of so-called academic language, required for complex thinking processes and successful engagement in the global economy. I remember the argument about the complex thinking processes. Do you remember that? Students can't analyze if they don't have the language to do it. And it was Nelson Flores who I first heard say, of course they can do that in their home language. They're not cognitively deficient. They can do these tasks. They just need the language to show that they can do it in English. All right, so Jim Cummins comes back and says, okay, I don't know, maybe I don't totally buy it. What does it look like? So he says, Flores and Rosa do not address the instructional implications of their claims that racial-linguistic ideologies permeate teachers' attempts to promote additive bilingualism and expand the range of registers students can use in academic contexts. And this isn't in my presentation, but I'm going to add this as well, that what we hear from folks in racial linguistics like Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa and Ophelia Garcia is there is absolutely no teacher blaming, right? They believe that teachers are doing what is in students' best interest. Rather, they're talking about, and you'll see me use the word epistemology later, they're talking about the ideologies that are underneath the work that we do. All right. Nelson Flores then comes back in 2021 and says, not only, do you like my Gen Z language? I'd love to mix it up. Not only does this sound like a dichotomy to me, but based on this definition, when somebody describes children as having VIX but not CAL, they're essentially arguing that they only engage in cognitively undemanding language practices. So what you do at home is basic, and what you do at school is cognitive. And knowing the landscape of a largely white teaching profession and largely Black and brown students, it's impossible to not recognize the racial-linguistic ideologies that are underpinning them. So I want you to channel Lai Chia right now. You'll remember that quote from the beginning. And the essential question for practice right now, this is going to take some humility, is how can we listen to those who are injured by our ways of thinking? Go ahead. All right, we're going to move on to our third and final story time. So I was so honored to be accepted to present at a conference in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and it was an ESL teacher conference, and it was on my work in teacher leadership. So I went with my colleague Amy Stoppelstead to, it's kind of the European TESOL equivalent, and I was very excited. And if I'm being honest, I thought I know a whole lot of things that I can teach them there, and I can learn from them too. Well, when I got to my session, two people came. One person was in the wrong room, and the other person was my friend. And I learned that the context there was very different. So the people who attended this conference were preparing students who were learning English for graduate school. So it was very much a higher ed sort of environment, and not a lot of interest in immigration issues or advocacy issues. So I presented at a conference in Northern Ireland to my friend. And I was really hoping, my colleague Mel Amon was there. Does anybody know her? So she and I did our graduate studies together at the University of Minnesota. She's from Wisconsin. Her work had been in Dakota, what I previously used the term revitalization, but I've learned that the term reclamation is a better term. So she's worked in Dakota reclamation, and she couldn't get a job here, so she moved her family to Northern Ireland, which is an interesting place for language reclamation as well, right? So Mel said, what do you want to do when you're here? And I said, well, I know we're at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, and I hear that Ireland is doing great things with refugees. I'd love to see what's going on. So, when I got there, she said, Michelle, I'm so sorry. It's this federal holiday and the schools are closed. Well, most of the schools. One of the schools is open. I could take you there, but they don't have English learners. It's an Irish immersion school. Do you want to go there? And I thought, well, sure. That's not what I thought I was going to do, but absolutely. So she takes me to it's a middle school and a high school Irish immersion school. It's a rainy day, as it typically is in Northern Ireland. And as we pull up to the school, there's a gentleman out front who is, he's doing some sort of maintenance in the lawn. And Mel calls out to him and says, hey, Gary, is the principal in? I have a friend who'd like to do a tour. And Gary says, no, he's not in, I'm sorry. I can show you around if you want. And Mel says, okay, let's do it. So we walk into the school, and as we walk in, Gary is inundated with these darling children in green and orange vests and plaid skirts, and they're all chatting with him in Irish. I think they're saying, good morning, how are you? And it's really cool to see. By the way, I learned there that in Ireland they don't use the word Gaelic to describe their language, they use the term Irish to describe their language. So I'm curious now, and I asked Gary, so what do you do here? And he said, well, I substitute teach from time to time. And I was like, cool, that's great. How long have you been doing that? And he said, well, since I founded the school in 1991. Okay, cool. So Gary's one of the founders of the school, right? And he's retired, and he's substitute teaching now in his retirement. And as he walks me around the building, I see such cool things. Like, I see a chemistry class where kids are doing an experiment in Irish language. Mind blown, that's amazing. And I started asking Gary questions, using, of course, my own frame of reference. So I said, did you learn Irish from your parents? And he said, no, my parents weren't allowed to speak Irish. The English wouldn't have allowed that. I said, oh, well, did you learn it from your grandparents? No, my grandparents weren't allowed to speak Irish either. And I said, well, where did you learn Irish? And he said, in prison. And I was like, oh, well, now my curiosity is piqued, right? Is that an appropriate question? But I've got to ask. I'm like, so how did you learn Irish in prison? And Gary says to me, well, when I was 17, I was arrested for supposed involvement with the IRA. This is a organization that is separatist and committed to withholding or to holding up Irish identity, Catholicism, language, naming, all of the things that go with Irish culture. And so he spent time in prison, and while he was there with other young Irishmen, they decided, you know what, we don't want to wear these prison uniforms with Union Jacks on our shoulders because we don't want to represent the British, so we're just going to wear our blankets. So they did that. They just wore their blankets. They also decided they didn't want to speak English because they didn't want to be understood by the guards. So they pieced together the little bits of Irish that they had come up with from their family, and they created a code that they could speak to each other together. They even successfully planned an escape. Gary escaped from prison real fast. And he didn't last long. He got caught again and ended up back in jail. And while he was there, a few things happened. One is a nun came to visit him regularly. That gave him a whole lot of comfort. Another one is a hunger strike began, and 10 of his friends died. If you've heard of Bobby Sands, he was the first to die in the hunger strike. So these are young men in their upper teens and early 20s who died. Gary knew a lot of them. Ultimately, they were released. After he got out of prison, he married the nun and had 3 children. I'm serious. And one of his children is a linguist at the university. I mean, it just doesn't get any better. And her name is Fanula. Ask me to spell Fanula. There's so many consonants. But they're wonderful, wonderful people. And so here I am with my co-author, Amy Stokelstad, and Gary at the end of the tour. And in my backpack, I have a short stack of my book, Teacher Leadership for School-Wide English Learning. I was going to give that to him as a gift. What an inappropriate gift, right? School-wide English learning, not helpful here. So I kept them in my backpack. And this was a lesson in many in what my dear friend introduced to me yesterday, intellectual humility, right? So when you show up in a space thinking that you're the knowledge holder, and then the frame changes and you recognize, I don't think I was as knowledgeable as I thought I was. So I learned a lot from this interaction. So, standard language ideology or linguistic imperialism. Remember, this was in the demand, right? The demand talked about standard language ideology and that this was entrenched in white supremacy and racism. Linguistic imperialism, of course, is that there's one right way or one preferred way to speak. Nation states do lean toward a standard language ideology. And standard language is the leading cultural currency in any nation state. So if you relocate and you want to be safe, if you want to have a relationship, if you want to have a job, standard language is assumed that you will acquire. Not only in any nation state, but also in any forest if you are maybe in cities. In the United States, ESL teachers serve as cultural brokers, imparting linguistic capital through instruction in the ways of standard English. Do you see the tension here? And standard language ideology is a manifestation of linguistic imperialism. So what is the role of educators in schools? Recognizing that tension, recognizing that rift. So, anybody a reading or a literacy teacher in the room? A couple. So in the reading world, you're familiar with the reading wars, right? So talking about different models to literacy development. In the math world, there's new math and old math. When it comes to language teaching and learning, it's prescriptivism versus descriptivism. So prescriptivism is the belief that there are correct and incorrect ways to use language, and a prescriptivist would ask, what should English be like, right? I think of my grandmother correcting me for double negatives. Do you remember the expression, ain't a word, so I ain't gonna say it? So, you know, there are right ways to talk and wrong ways to talk. And a prescriptivist linguist I think of as a police officer. So they're aware of the rules and they're holding you to those rules, right? Descriptivism is a non-judgmental approach that analyzes how language is actually used by its speakers. So descriptivist asks, what is English? So I think of this as a painter, as an artist who is, you know, describing what they see. And I got this frame, by the way, from Nelson Flores. We do have some polarized commitments in our field. We're in a bit of an identity crisis. I think we always have been. And one of our commitments is that educators acknowledge that academic English is a form of social capital, and it's their responsibility to provide students with this tool for social mobility. I would venture to guess that that's why we're all here today, right? We want to give students the tools that they need to be successful in the next space, whether that's honors chemistry, whether that's cosmetology school, whether that's getting a job, whatever it is, we want them to have the tools to be successful there. So this commitment, I think, is one that we can generally agree on. Another one is educators acknowledge the importance of validating and valuing home languages and dialects and welcoming them into academic spaces. I've seen this done beautifully in classrooms, and what's interesting is when I present to teachers, they say, well, yeah, we do both of those things. But in the scholarly community, there's a huge divide here, right? We have team academic language and team translanguaging. And team translanguaging is all about heritage language revitalization, immersion education, bilingual ed, and team academic language is, you know, ESL. And there's not a lot of talking between us, and our scholarship doesn't cross over very much, which I think is really problematic. So I want to do a gloss over here of academic language and what it has meant over time. Could I think it's 7. Could I have 7 volunteers to line up right here? Okay, these are the big names in the field. My guess is that if you've been in the field for a while, you will recognize these names. So what I'm going to ask you to do is read the year, read the quote, and read the name, okay?
2002, academic language is the language of school, literacy, content, and higher learning. Susan Dutro and Carol Moran.
Thank you.
2007, academic language is the set of words, grammar, and discourse strategies used to describe complex ideas, higher order thinking processes, and abstract concepts. Jeff Sligers.
2008, despite frequent invocations of academic language and the widespread concern about its inadequate development, there is no simple definition of what academic language is. Catherine Snow, Paula,
2010, academic language differs considerably from the social conversational language that is used on the playground, at home, and at cocktail parties. Academic language is essential for success in school. Mary Ellen Vogt, Jenna Echevarria, and Deborah Short.
Thank you. And you might remember or recognize Vogt, Echevarria, and Short as the authors of PSYOP.
For 2019, academic language is a racial-linguistic ideology that frames racialized students as linguistically deficient and in need of remediation. Nelson Flores.
2020, academic language reinforces the power of the white monolingual middle class while failing Latinx bilinguals by positioning them as in constant need of linguistic remediation. Ophelia Garcia.
Myself and many of the people in the room, we've watched this happen, right? And we know as descriptivists that language does evolve, right? I'm the parent of a child with disabilities, and language used to describe people with disabilities evolves over time. And it doesn't evolve based on the masses, it evolves based on the person who might be injured by that term. So I want to put this chronology out there just so that we can see it and be aware of it. So coming to terms with the evolution of the term academic language. At best, the term academic language is an apolitical term that has taken on an exclusionary tone over time. At worst, it is a gatekeeping term, referring to an academy that is entrenched in white supremacy and patriarchy. For this reason, instead of using the term academic language, we refer to the language that is outside of students' linguistic repertoire as the language of access. When it comes to the language of access, the role of the teacher is to open as many doors as possible for students and to teach them how to open doors for themselves. And this is how we land on the concept for the book, LILA, which is language of identity, language of access. And Natalia Benjamin's keynote this afternoon will be focused on the language of identity. I'll be focusing on the language of access here, which is linguistically expanding instruction. And I want to be clear that we're not trying, I had a long conversation with Nelson Flores when I was noodling over this, and he's like, don't create another dichotomy like Dix and Cal. So I want to be clear that this is not another dichotomy, right? That there's a lot of blending, that sometimes language of identity is the language of access, but there are two ways that we can think about language. So I know that the haters are going to come for me and say, but isn't that just academic language under a new name? And here's my response to that. I'll start by telling a story about my family. When my twins were in kindergarten, they came home and they're like, Mom, I want to show you something. Can I search it up on the internet? And I thought, that's wrong. Maybe it's because they go to Spanish immersion that they don't know how to say look it up, because it's look it up, actually, on the internet. I think I even said that to them, which is terrible. And then maybe a week later, I'm at my parents' house and my mom says, she's the only person who calls me this, Shelly, can you call it up on my phone? She's saying the same thing, right? So what is this? This is language evolution in lifetime, across generations in my family. None of us are wrong, right? They're all right, but there are different ways to say the same thing. Professionally, we have done the same thing with the term code switching. So I'm going to present that as a model. The face value, of course, is just what you see. The epistemology is the belief system underneath it. So code switching is the act of using more than one language in discourse. So if I notice that you slip in a word in Karen, you're code switching, right? Translanguaging, same. I see you using a different word, and that's translanguaging. But what is the epistemological difference? It's huge. So the epistemology that undergirds code switching is that humans have multiple linguistic codes that we can switch on and switch off as we choose. So I'm going to turn off Italian and I'm going to turn on English, right? What we know from cognitive science is that is not how human brains work. Humans have one linguistic repertoire that is cognitively activated and accessible at all times. So the student who knows the word in Karen isn't saying it, they're suppressing it because they know that you don't know that word in Karen, right? So we're seeing a move toward the term translanguaging because our understanding has changed. Academic language here is similar. Again, face value is very similar, but the epistemology is different. So the epistemology that undergirds academic language is students should use this language in the classroom, right? I think about Nelson Flores' work in appropriateness. What is appropriate to use in the classroom? The ideology underneath the language of access is students should activate their entire linguistic repertoire in the classroom. So how can we teach this? And I'm mindful of time. So I'm going to suggest through noticing and forecasting. Again, I'm a functionalist, so I think it's about preparing students to be in the space that they need to or want to be in. So if I notice students' need for language development at the word level or sentence level or discourse level via their writing, via their speaking, that's an opportunity for me to teach them that language. I can also do that using forecasting. So forecasting is looking forward, thinking about what's coming. I'm going to use an example of my daughter who would love to go to cosmetology school, and I think when she talks about that, well, there's some language that you're gonna need to learn, even as a native English speaker in cosmetology school. And I hope that her instructors are thinking about these areas, text, task, and test. So you're gonna need to know, the textbook is called Milady. You're gonna need to know what is in the Milady textbooks, right? You're gonna need to know the different hairstyles. You're gonna need to know the language that's there. You're also gonna need to be able to complete tasks. So describe what you're doing and use the language. Do you have the language to do that? And then lastly, test, right? Are you tested on the language that you learned? And are you ever inadvertently tested on language when it's not a language test, right? It's a content test. So these are the 3 areas that I think teachers can focus on, both ESL teachers and Gen Ed teachers, when we're thinking about what language to teach. And I use cosmetology intentionally because I think there are so many spaces that are not deemed academic that absolutely have their own language. All right, so our last question is, I want you to be thinking about Abdi and the email that he sent to John. And the question now is, what does liberatory learning look like in a multilingual classroom? So spend about a minute talking about this. There is no assumption that we're going to answer these questions today. The 3 questions that we have gone into are, how can we make the language of school accessible to multilingual learners of English? How can we listen to those who are injured by our ways of thinking? And what does liberatory learning look like in a multilingual classroom? So my suggestion is that we bring these questions with us, right? That we have this intellectual humility, that we move forward with curiosity in order to arrive at the answer. And I'm going to close with a quote that is commonly attributed to Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. And if you are the woman in the hammock, like I was, your job is to listen. We'll be having a book signing afterwards. You're more than welcome to come, and thank you.